You're listening to Science, Powering Tomorrow, the GNS Science podcast that demystifies complex science concepts and shines a light on its critical and very cool groundbreaking science. Some of my best friends are scientists, and here at GNS, there are endless stories to tell and fascinating people to meet. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Ann Clive, a hazard and risk management scientist with GNS. I am so pleased to have you join me on our storytelling adventures as we dive deep into the science and innovation produced right here at GNS. Together, we'll learn about the critical impact of that cool work and how it is improving our lives and livelihoods every single day. So let's go. It's time to get inspired by science. And today we're talking earthquake resilience with Dr. Anna Kaiser and Dr. Nicola Litchfield. Welcome, Anna and Nicola.
Thank you, Marianne.
Hi.
Can we start off by having you guys introduce yourself? Anna, what is your role at GNS?
Thanks, Marianne. I am one of the leadership team of our natural hazards and risks research portfolio. So this is a range of science we do across different perils like earthquake, tsunami, volcano and landslide. And my particular interest is strongly in earthquake and tsunami space. I'm a seismologist by training, so I'm really interested in ground shaking, the way the Earth moves, and in particular how the ground shaking is modified depending on the particular location that you happen to be in.
And Nicola, you work in earthquakes as well?
That's right, yes, but I'm a paleoseismologist, so that literally means past earthquakes. So my data typically is I go out in the field and study evidence for past earthquakes that have happened hundreds, thousands of years ago on faults or impacts on the landscape, such as uplifting the coast along the Hikurangi subduction zone. So active faults and past earthquakes.
A lot of field work then.
That's right, yeah, that's good.
What got you into paleoseismology?
I kind of always liked plate tectonics, I guess, but we didn't really have much geology at school. I grew up on a farm, so I really always liked the outdoors and trying to understand landscapes and things. It's just really when I got to university and started to go out in the field and, active faults just really captured my imagination, and earthquakes happening all around the world, and thought, there's good things to study here too.
Favorite field site in New Zealand?
Along the east coast, the Wairarapa, Cape Palliser area. It's my favourite.
It's a pretty beautiful place to work.
It is. It's very cool, yeah.
And what about you, Anna? What got you into earthquake research?
Well, I guess I always did enjoy both arts and sciences at school and at university, and I couldn't decide what to do. And I always really did like maths and physics. And like Nicola, also very much enjoyed being outside in the outdoors and just going into our backcountry and seeing the amazing landscapes provided a way to tie together that maths and physics and that computational side together with something meaningful in terms of the world we live in. So that's how I got into geophysics, I guess, at university.
And I do think there is an element of the arts sort of that's needed in the earth science to sort of pull together that picture across such extreme scales.
Absolutely. I feel like there's an element of science that is very creative and also needs, communication skills and understanding and different elements. And that's also, I think, something that's really interesting about the jobs that we do, that we get to delve into different aspects of both science and arts and communication and other things. So it's really an interesting field to work in.
Yeah. So today we're talking earthquake resilience. And I want our listeners to imagine a time when a magnitude 7.5 earthquake on the Wellington Fault is as insignificant as a thunderstorm, where the buildings we live and work in are built to withstand ground shaking and ground deformation caused by earthquakes. This isn't just a dream. Every day, scientists and engineers are working side by side to improve building, infrastructure, and urban design to be safer and more resilient to the effects of earthquakes. With new technology uncovering the Earth's secrets, we have never been in a better position to use this knowledge to fortify our built environment and ensure we build smartly. We're going to discuss the future of our dynamic landscape and how scientists are supporting smarter cities to keep people safer and the economy moving. Anna and Nicola, it all sounds really interesting, and today we're going to just scratch beneath the surface a bit. I'll start off by asking you, Anna, what is a smarter city? What does it look like?
That is a really good question, isn't it? Because I think if you think back to the days of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they wouldn't have been able to imagine the cities that we live in today. Technology is advancing so quickly. We can't really know for sure what it's going to look like. But we know it will look different. And we also know that our cities will always experience natural hazards like earthquakes. And it's very important to continue to think about how to prepare for these in the future and getting smarter and smarter at doing that. So if we look at past earthquakes in New Zealand, the majority of the fatalities did come from building damage or building collapse. So it is a big factor to consider in building smarter cities. We've got strong building standards in New Zealand that really look at preserving life safety, and if we do get another big one. But there's lots more. We're continuously improving, lots more that we can do in the future by understanding all kinds of things, from exactly how the ground might shake in future earthquakes, exactly how the ground might break, as Nicola will talk about, and how we can be really smart about engineering solutions that take into account those things.
So is it really about just building better buildings, stronger buildings?
There's all sorts of things we can do, aren't there? I think there's a big element, how do we build better and smarter? And then there's also an element, how do we actually create early warning systems, for instance, that might alert us to what's happening in real time, so that quick action can be taken and we can recover more quickly. So there are lots of elements of the science we do that helps to improve resilience when an earthquake happens.
What, in the context of a smart city, what does resilient look like?
That's a really good question. I guess, importantly, right, life safety is a huge factor for us to preserve. These events are really destructive and really scary for people. But there's also the element of how do we continue to operate? How do we continue to have key services like electricity, water, and transport links, supply chains? How do we keep all of those things going? And how can we, how we can not just have preserve life safety with the way that we design, but increasing interest in how we can continue to operate in those buildings, how we can continue to use those for their post-earthquake or repair them quickly, or even how we can identify what damage might have occurred so that we can mitigate its effects as quickly as possible. Because we know that these events, New Zealanders know well, especially Cantabrians, that the effects of these earthquakes are huge on society and on the economy for some time afterwards. And the better we can prepare, the better we can get through it.
And thinking of a smart city, I imagine technology will play a big role in what that looks like.
Absolutely. As a seismologist, I get really excited when we think about ground shaking. It's not just about how strong or weak the ground shakes, it's just about how it shakes. So, lots of different types of shaking. You could have long rolling motion, which tends to affect your bigger buildings, or you can have short, sharp shaking, which might affect your smaller structures. And you can design, once you know about that ground shaking, if you really know at your location what you might expect and the likelihood of that shaking, you can make some really smart decisions and design some very innovative ways to really understand what could happen and prevent the worst damage. And I guess what's really exciting is you think about, with increasing computational power and modelling capability, you can create even things like digital twins, where you've got physics-based modelling that goes all the way through from the earthquake through to how the ground shakes, how the ground might rupture, through to how a building might perform. The end-to-end kind of system understanding, well, this is what could happen. How can we mitigate those effects and how we can design for what we might expect.
Are we there yet? Do we have digital twins of earthquakes and shaking and what we can expect?
We're just really launching into the field of digital twins, so it's really got some global momentum, and increasingly we've got the foundation for it here in New Zealand and in different areas. But there's so much more we could do, and so much more we need to do to build out the science to really have an end-to-end system that will allow us to explore all kinds of different things, from how a building might perform to how society might be impacted. And then explore mitigation strategies. How do we invest smartly in the things that are really going to make a difference for people and for the economy?
So you've mentioned that the different kinds of shaking can have really different sorts of impacts on different kinds of building structures. Can you talk to us a little bit about the building standards in New Zealand and what that means for earthquake resilience?
Sure. So we have built here at GNS with our university collaborators the National Seismic Hazard Model, which really gives us quantifiable information on what are the chances of shaking of different strengths, and what are the chances of different types of shaking in different locations. So if you go anywhere in New Zealand, you've got this nationally consistent view of this is the type of shaking and the likelihood of it happening in this location in order to design better. And this is really a model of models. So it's really bringing in all together a lot of the science that we do into one kind of place that engineers and other people can pick up this information in order to design better. It also underpins New Zealand's building code and building design standards, I should say, so that the information can be directly used to build smarter and better. And we're getting better and better at the science that underpins these models. There's still much more we can do and much more we can learn. What we have right now is really a good solid foundation. And where we can go in the future is really getting closer and closer to what is the ground shaking going to be like in this specific location. One of the examples I like to point to, people might remember the Kaikoura earthquake from 2016, and we had strong ground shaking felt many places in New Zealand. But the type of ground shaking that was experienced in Wellington, say, was that kind of longer rolling, slow motion that you kind of get in sedimentary basins when the seismic waves get amplified as you've got these softer sediments near the surface. So that really impacted in this earthquake the sort of mid-rise tallest structures in Wellington, and we saw quite a lot of damage there. But that particular earthquake didn't impact so much, say, Cuba Street, if you've been there, with the shorter buildings. But that's really just a feature of the Kaikoura earthquake, right? So we could get many other different types of earthquakes where we need to consider the impact on, say, Cuba Street or other locations. And that's one of the really interesting things to understand from a seismologist perspective.
So the way that earthquake happened, the way the energy was released, really affected how the buildings responded.
Yeah, that's right. There's a few factors that go into earthquake shaking. You've got the earthquake source, so how big it was, where it was.
Take us back to Earthquake 101, actually.
Sure. Yeah, so, we consider things like how big the earthquake was, but also how much of the ground ruptured, how the extent of the earthquake, how far away it was is a big factor to consider, because the seismic waves, as they propagate from the source to your site, they change character, right? So there is often a loss of energy as you go away from the source, but also the potential to amplify the wave as you get into softer sediments or amplify different types of shaking.
So the shaking gets stronger.
Yeah, so if you've got a sedimentary basin, for instance, what happens is the seismic waves can propagate into that basin and get trapped inside and reverberate, and also increase in amplitude as they reach the surface. So the ground shaking there can be quite different than you might feel on, say, a hill that's next to the city.
And some of our cities are on sedimentary basins, are they?
Quite a few.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously sedimentary basins are quite common in New Zealand. They also tend to be the places where you have flatter land that's easier to build. What's important to consider is the type of shaking for your location. As I've said before, the different structures that you can build are sensitive to different types of shaking, and there are things that engineers can do to modify how the building might respond. Some good examples are things like base isolation used in Te Papa, which is New Zealand's been world leading in developing this type of technology.
And what does base isolation do?
It's really a way of dealing with some of those, what I've just described as really those long period waves, that's long, slow rolling motion you might get in sedimentary basins, by allowing the building to move with the ground, so basically the base isolation allows the building to kind of move in the earthquake in a way that reduces damage.
Okay.
And there are other things as well, like other ways of sort of damping seismic motion. I actually took a trip to Taiwan a few years ago, and they have Taipei 101, which is one of the biggest buildings or tallest buildings in the world. And at the top of the building, they've got a damping mechanism, sort of like a big pendulum that's hung from the top of the building, and it really sort of allows the building to modify the way it moves in both earthquakes and typhoons to mitigate some of the worst effects. It's really fascinating.
Wow, so just redistributes the motion or the weight somehow?
Yeah, sort of allows the building to move but then come back to the centre. And it also, by using things like this, you can kind of also consider the way, the building resonance, so the way that the building moves or is susceptible to different frequencies of ground shaking. So, if you know what shaking you can expect at that location, those are things you can consider when you're modifying the way the building responds.
So you mentioned we have base isolators at Te Papa. Can you tell us a bit about how those work?
Sure. So, New Zealand's been world leading in developing base isolation systems, so very cool, innovative engineering solutions. And anyone who's been to Te Papa might have been able to, you can go down and look underneath the building and see it's kind of placed on these big, effective, a platform of these base isolators. And that really just allows the building to move differently from the ground around it, kind of modifying the way the building experiences the shaking, and so mitigating the damage. And it's really effective for these kind of really long rolling ground motions that we might get, say, in sedimentary basins in exactly the places like Te Papa.
Right, so it's just a little bit less rigid.
Yeah, that's right. It allows the building to move differently, modifying the way that it's really sensing that earthquake ground motion.
So as we're thinking about smarter cities and earthquake resilient cities, we get a lot of shaking in New Zealand and in a lot of our cities. Is there anywhere overseas we can look to as a good example of how to have a smart earthquake resilient city?
Obviously it's really great in New Zealand to keep up with global science, which is moving really rapidly, contributing to the global field and also sharing knowledge back into New Zealand. And we have a limited set, if you like, of large past earthquakes in New Zealand to study. So it's really important for us to learn from global earthquakes and to use global data to really understand the range of earthquakes that could happen in the future and the types of shaking that might be experienced. And I know Nicola will have a lot more to say about that with paleoseismology, how we delve into past earthquakes here in New Zealand as well as use global data.
Yeah, so we can use our models to understand what kind of shaking might happen and what that effect might be on our buildings. But Nicola, some of your work looks into what's happened in the past before maybe we had a bunch of buildings around New Zealand.
Yes, as I mentioned, I study past earthquakes and active faults. So a lot of what Anna's been talking about has been shaking damage, but there's also the actual damage of the fault rupture itself. So we know, for example, the 1855 Wairarapa earthquake had really large ruptures up to 18 metres of sideways movement. One side moved relative to the other and 6 metres of uplift of the coast. So we can get that sort of information and think about what that's going to do to our cities in the future. So the building code, the design standards Anna was talking about, again, they're all about ground shaking. They don't actually talk specifically to fault rupture. So there are things we can do for that. In New Zealand, for example, there are some individual structures that have been designed to accommodate fault rupture. So like the Clyde Dam down in Otago has got this interesting thing in the middle of it called a slip joint. So the fault goes through the dam, and the idea is that when it ruptures, the dam will not break and this joint will go down and seal up the crack kind of thing. So it's pretty innovative, untested. I think it's the only one like it in the world. But so there are things like that we can do. And again, in cities, there's a lot more we could be doing around engineering, like our as Anna mentioned, some of our critical infrastructure like pipelines and water and things like that. We don't need everything to break along a fault rupture, like along the Wellington Fault. We could be designing them so that they could accommodate that in an earthquake. And again, another really cool overseas example for that is in Alaska, and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline goes across Alaska and goes across the Denali Fault. They designed that to have, it's got a big kink in it, and it's on these sliders. The idea was when the fault moved, it could move, and it did. In 1982, There was an earthquake on this fault, and it moved several metres, and the whole thing just bent more
Wow.
And probably had a bit of fixing up to do afterwards, but the point is it didn't rupture.
Right, it kind of
So
moved with the earthquake.
That's right, the ground moved and it accommodated it. So there's things we could be doing more about, in these big earthquakes when the faults rupture at the ground surface.
Can you explain to us, sort of taking us back to basics, what are the different ways that a fault can rupture and the kind of movement and ground cracking that you might see?
Sure. So faults are long, kilometres long, and they go down kilometres into the crust. So most earthquakes start down 10 to 15 kilometres and come up to the surface. And then when the fault gets to the surface, generally we sort of break them into two end member types. So they can either move sideways, one side moves left or right relative to the other, or up and down.
Okay.
And actually in New Zealand, most faults do both. As I mentioned before, the Wairarapa earthquake does both. Metres. So you can have, if you've got a pipeline across it, it could be cut in half sideways or lifted up on one side relative to the other. So, and that's permanent movement. So it's not like an earthquake wave that,
Dissipates.
shakes the ground, moves the ground, and then it sort of settles back down again. It's permanent once it's happened. So we know that the Wairarapa earthquake uplifted Wellington Harbour by a couple of metres, which was great at the time because it gave us a beach to make the Hutt Road along and so on. But the problem is that also the Wellington Fault is there, and one day it's going to go down. Not that particular bit, but in Petone and the city. And we've again seen that in the Edgecombe earthquake. In 1987, on the western side of a couple of the big faults that ruptured in that earthquake, the ground went down, 1 up to 2 metres, and that can cause long-term problems from flooding. You now got land much closer to sea level, future sea level rise impacts and things. So, so fault movements are metre scale and permanent.
So are most of the faults that you're looking at from historic times when people have been around?
No, most of the information we have is much longer than that, because faults rupture on every sort of hundreds to thousands of years, and our historical records in New Zealand is pretty short. So we've got some historical records, we've got some Māori records, but beyond that we have to look at the geology, look at the landscape to go back thousands of years.
And I understand the ruptures can be quite complex. The Kaikoura event that Anna was talking about, there were lots of sort of splays and offshoots and things. There's more than just one fault can go at a time, right?
That's right. That was crazy. That was probably the most faults that have ever ruptured on one earthquake in the world.
Wow.
So it really opened our eyes to that. But actually, when we go back and look at the past historical earthquakes, we now realise that the Wairarapa earthquake had several faults rupture. The Edgecombe earthquake had several faults rupture. So we think it's actually quite common, and probably more so in New Zealand just because we have so many faults that it's just quite likely when one ruptures, another one will rupture as well. So we have to model that in the National Seismic Hazard Model now. That's been a big change in the recent version to model multi-fault ruptures, as we call them.
Right. And capture that and that's captured in the National Seismic Hazard Model now.
Yes. We've got lots and lots of multi-fault ruptures. So, the challenge is on us now actually to provide the data to show what's sort of realistic, what we've seen in the geological past to try and constrain that. How big, how often.
You've mentioned the Wairarapa fault rupture a couple of times. Can you tell us a bit more about that earthquake? Have you done some work on it?
I haven't done much, but I've looked into it a little bit, and we've mapped the faults in the Wairarapa recently. And it was in 1855 in January, so Wellington was pretty young. There was not many people living in the Wairarapa at the time, so thankfully perhaps right where the fault ruptured, but it certainly had a huge impact on Wellington City. So I mentioned that it uplifted, so the Wairarapa fault goes along the Wairarapa Valley, so it might have had a little bit of subsidence to the east, but mostly it was uplift. Caused a massive tsunami up to 12 metres across Palliser Bay to Kopi, and it went over where the airport is now, from Lyell Bay over to Evans Bay, and then sloshed around in the harbour for hours and hours afterwards, caused landslides. Landslide did kill some people in the Wairarapa. Caused a lot of shaking in Wellington City. A lot of the buildings, all the chimneys fell down in a lot of buildings, and a person was killed in Wellington City. And that was that, along with the 1848 Awatere earthquake, is really why we have so many wooden buildings in Wellington, as we learned pretty quickly that brick buildings don't work very well here, but wooden buildings stood up really well. So it certainly had impacts immediately on the young city of Wellington.
So we've used a lot of this work to inform the way we build and grow resilience in places like Wellington.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Do we know where all of these faults are in New Zealand?
We wish we did. That would be the dream, is to know where all the faults are everywhere in New Zealand. And we're getting better at it. And there are good technologies now that we can use to do that, in particular LiDAR data. So that stands for light detection and ranging, but basically it's collected from an aeroplane that shoots radar signals down to the ground and back again, and then makes a big model of the ground surface. And then they can do some pretty cool modelling to remove things like the trees. So if you get the radar pulses can go through forests and you can get the bare earth, which is amazing. So it allows us to see the faults where they're covered in trees. Like, for example, the Alpine Fault's really hard to see on the ground because of all the forest and bits of the Wellington Fault to the north. So now we can strip those trees off and see the ground. So it's pretty amazing, and it's really, really, really detailed. Like, it's 1 metre resolution, so we can really see the faults. So, for example, the Wairarapa Fault, again, we know it ruptured in 1855. We knew where it was. It's pretty clear in the landscape. But suddenly when you see the LiDAR data, we're just seeing thousands of little traces, and we're getting hints again that some other faults may have ruptured in the same earthquake and just weren't known about because there was no one there and no one's done work on it since. So yeah, it's allowing us to really map the location of the faults really accurately. So that really helps for cities and things, and knowing where it crosses, things like critical infrastructure or building, to have really accurate locations. The other thing it allows us to do is to work out how much the fault has moved in past earthquakes. So the amount of displacement, how many metres it might have moved sideways or up and down, which is, again, really helpful for engineering designing in the future, to know how much it's moved in the past, so we can design to mitigate that in the future.
Can you tell that from looking at the LiDAR data, or do you have to go out and dig a hole and have a look at the rocks?
Sometimes you do both. Sometimes it's you look at the LiDAR, then you go in the field and then you come back. But what we're looking at is things like past river channels that we can see. You can see it on one side of the fault, and then you can see it on another side of the fault, and you can see, then you can measure how much it's offset, or the amount of a vertical offset of a surface. So yeah, it's incredible what we can do. And there are semi-automated tools now that actually just allow you to slide the fault back along slide the ground back along the fault using the LiDAR data and measure how much that is. So it takes out some of that sort of manual, more subjective interpretation, and allows us to do large areas and a bit more objectively using these models.
Is there somewhere where all of this information is shared or accessible to someone who wants to learn more about faults?
So yes, the New Zealand Active Faults Database is kind of our one-stop shop place to go to find out where all the faults are. So there's a web map for that, the New Zealand Active Faults Database web map. And for a long time we've had a more regional scale data set. So for the whole country, it's a little bit out of date in places, but it sort of covers the whole country. But
so if we have this map of where all of the faults are, can we use that information to inform where we build?
Absolutely, yes. So we have land use planning guidelines, which recommend that we don't build on faults if they're like high risk faults, so it's risk based. So the faults that rupture more often and big earthquakes, we don't really want people building on those, but the faults that rupture less regularly or maybe are quite wide, so the deformation under a particular building or a piece of infrastructure may not be that much, then it's probably okay. You can probably again design your foundations or something.
So there's a real spectrum of how things can rupture.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So so knowing where the faults are and how much they move, and how often you move, that gives you a sense. It gives you a way to calculate the risk and what you could potentially do to mitigate that risk.
And we're doing that across New Zealand?
Yes, yeah. The guidelines have been around for quite a while now, and they need a bit of an update, but they are being used some way or other on most of the district plans, particularly the new generation district plans that are going through in most parts of the country at the moment are using that. So they're having these really good fault hazard layers that are risk-based on their maps, which is really good for land use planning.
Interesting. And as you said, though, there's lots and lots of faults. They're across the country. We can't really avoid them, can we?
No, we can't. And we've got lots of infrastructure built on top of them already in Wellington City, built on top of the fault. So we can't just red zone everywhere. That's just not practical. So again, it's about mitigation. What can we do to design our buildings better, our infrastructure better, to mitigate, to accommodate the movement when it happens?
So a smart earthquake resilient city of the future would be designed for this. In your mind, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I would like to see, we know where the faults are, you've got a zone, and then in that zone everything is built to accommodate the fault movement, accommodate that shaking, yes, and that people, don't notice the earthquake when it happens. There might be a bit of fixing up to do, but not nearly as much as what we're doing now. Yeah.
And what about you, Anna? Is that what does the future smart city for New Zealand look like?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a city that's built well with really innovative solutions. There's just some really intriguing things popping up in research space that are really early days. And I think with science, you can never say never, right? And one thing that's been brought up is something like seismic invisibility cloaking, which is, to me, as a seismologist, is intriguing. It's so far out there in research space. A way that, and this is really about ways that you understand how seismic waves affect buildings, but also structures and hills and valleys and other things affect seismic waves. So are there ways to modify things around our buildings or in our environment that actually modify the seismic waves as they're coming in? This idea is out there in research space, but it's a fascinating one, and we just don't know what the future's going to hold and what innovations like this might be possible, 100 years, 200, 300 years from now. The other thing that we can also obviously design a lot better for earthquakes, but in terms of the way we respond, I think there's heaps of potential there. If we think about early warning systems in the future that give us advanced warning of shaking, and then also, really real-time understanding with our physics-based modelling, how have buildings been affected, which buildings might be affected, which ones are safe to reoccupy, which ones are need assessment. We can do this faster and faster in the future in real time. So not only can we prepare better, we'll also have information on hand about exactly what's happened and how we can mitigate those worst effects. Emergency responders can go in really quickly and tackle the key things that are affecting people in our economy, and people can get back on their feet much more quickly. So it's about designing smarter ahead of time and being able to respond much better when these things do happen.
Yeah, those impacts really last a long time after the shaking stops, don't they?
That's right, and I think anyone who's been through a really large earthquake understands, the impact it has on them, their families, their communities, and the economy of the region as well. It's huge. So the more we can do to prepare ahead of time, the better.
It's really exciting to hear about all the research that's going into reducing those impacts and helping us create more livable cities. Thank you for your time today, Anna and Nicola. It's been a fascinating conversation to learn more about earthquake resilience and the critical work happening at GNS. So thanks both.
You're welcome.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Today's discussion is just the start. We have so many cool stories to tell here at GNS Science, so be sure to check back in on our podcasts. We are going to be delving deep into our natural hazards, our future energy solutions, the wonders of our environment, and the climate challenges we face. We'll be taking a look at the clever ways we dig deep and learn about New Zealand's past and how that helps us forecast our future. Don't forget that you can keep up to date with all things GNS at gns.cri.nz or on all our social media channels. Join us in the next Science Powering Tomorrow episode. Thanks for listening.